Welcome to the future of payroll and workforce management insights by HR.com, your go-to resource for insights into payroll and workforce management. From navigating compliance and technology trends to exploring the latest in global payroll solutions, we're here to keep you ahead of the curve. Join us as we dive into the forces reshaping payroll and share practical strategies to optimize your workforce management. Let's get started. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Future of Payroll and Workforce Management, a podcast here at HR.com, where I am your host. My name is Brent Skinner. Do all sorts of things here. You see me every episode, so enough about me. Today's about my guest, obviously, Kim Bohr, who is President and CEO of SparkEffect. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Brent.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for being a guest on the podcast. We have a super duper interesting topic today. It's called Trust. The working title for this episode is Trust by Design, Why Workforce Management Must Account for Human Disruption. And I think we might keep that. But in any event, you wrote an article at HR.com very recently, Caregiving Benefits Among Strongest Signals of Workplace Fairness and Trust. And it sort of presents some findings, really interesting findings from a research report that you folks at SparkEffect recently published. And we're going to get into all of that. It's really, really exciting stuff. We had a super duper interesting conversation in the green room a few weeks ago when we talked about doing this podcast. We do have a green room here, even though we're not a late night talk show, but we have a green room at the podcast. As I like to ask all my guests at the outset of these episodes, and I'll ask you too, before we get into the topic, is there's a lot of passion in this space. So many people get into the world of work, various angles, even payroll. There's so much passion in it. And of course, you're not in payroll, but you're doing something really, really interesting. What got you into this field? What galvanizes you every day, gets you out of bed and ripping and roaring when it comes to the world of work?
It's such a wonderful question to be able to speak to, and thank you again for having me. What started for me was really early on in my career. I didn't have a lot of great mentor examples of leadership, unfortunately. And I really became curious around why. Why is that the case? And I started off in really large organizations and decided that I just didn't like the lack of impact I felt I could have, and wanted to just really find my way into something that had more ability to shape and learn from and grow. And so in that process, I really started to get clarity around what I liked about business, the passion I have, what I like about people. And I started to really form this strongly held belief that I have to this day. And so for as long as I can really recall, when I think about that early part of my career, I've always had this belief that business has an obligation to be better than it is today. And that to do so, it requires the focus on people, the people that it serves the communities and the whole operation that it's evolving in. And so to me, the real path of getting to business and that obligation I think we have is really investing in people. And so that's all where my passion and continued work has been in this, and it will continue to be so.
Yeah, and I just want to put like a sort of a punctuation point on that, because this is a real area of interest of mine too, is the investment in people. And it may be difficult to trace back to, which investment and what actually led to this or that or the other great outcome with people. And that's what makes it so difficult to sort of translate it to the general ledger, to an accounting spreadsheet and all this kind of stuff. It's where I really think generally accepted accounting principles fall short. It's kind of like at the edge of what it can actually measure. And so, but I learned from watching Primetime Live, enough of those episodes, that a preponderance of circumstantial evidence can put somebody in jail for life. So, at some point we'd have to just say, hey, you know what? This works. So we're going
Yep,
to spend the money.
exactly.
Anyway, so if we were kind of have like a sub headline for this episode, I love what we came up with. What if trust were treated less like a cultural aspiration and more like a measurable business input? And that really kind of gets to to the core of this research that you came out with that we're going to
Mhm.
talk about. So, my first question to you is, and feel free to share, any research findings that you have that are relevant. Uh, why do
Yeah.
you believe trust should be treated? Why do you think it should be treated as a measurable business metric rather than a soft cultural ideal?
Well, we had curiosity around what was happening in organizations with trust about a year ago, and we were looking at AI as a disruptor. We were looking at just this the return to office policies, all these different things, and we wanted to start to quantify it. And one of the things the direct answer to your question is we were able to actually show you can measure it. And so for all the thinking of trust is soft, there's this sense of, well, we know trust is important and gosh, it'd be nice if we can measure it. And at the same time, we're over here and we're taking action that is completely counter to the belief of around trust. And so we wanted to actually bring in hard data and really make the case that it actually should be measured just like any other KPI you're measuring in your business. And in fact, it can be. And so that was really just really reinforcing my beliefs around improving business, thinking about helping to give data to many of our HR partners who are wrestling with this with their other executive colleagues and trying to really shape why it should be measured this way. So the way we really started to think about it was we created this trust performance index that was made up of 5 particular domains. And just, very quickly without going into detail, there's strategic clarity, psychological safety, relational continuity, technology and systems trust, fairness and change impact perception. That technology and system trust is really a very interesting one for this conversation because employees really trust how the systems are designed and introduced and implemented until there's an error, right? Until there's something that gets rolled out poorly. And then immediately that trust is really fractured. And we were
Mm,
able to show this through this research we did. And just to bring just a finer point on the research, we wanted it to really be data rich and stand on its own. And we partnered with a PhD who's a workplace anthropologist in order to structure this as a really deep research survey that focused uh, predominantly on our US based organizations. And so that it went out as an anonymous survey. So we really got to come back and look at it. And the respondents were 50% were people leaders and 50% were individual contributors. So it was a very interesting survey to get back and really see that trust is fracturing and there's
mm.
things that we can do about it.
You know what's interesting? So first of all, excuse me, trust is fracturing. That's sort of just an intuition that a lot of us have, right?
Hmm.
Um, and thinking about the question, and thank you for sharing those details about the survey and the report and the model. Um, it's I mean, how do you know if you have a good culture, unless you can measure it, all right? Are
Yeah.
we just all kind of walking in and say, like, kind of like just putting our finger up in the wind and saying, "Oh, yeah, it's, yep, I
Yeah.
think, yeah, our culture, it feels good. Yeah, I think it's good." I mean, certainly a good culture is apt to feel good,
Hmm.
right? To more people than not. But to be able to measure it, to have sort of a bellwether, right? To
Hmm.
know what's going like a Richter scale or whatever to kind of like measure, hey, is there an earthquake coming here? You know, that's really important.
It is. And just to go a little deeper on what you're mentioning there, a lot of listeners may think, well, we do measure it. We measure it through engagement surveys, or we measure it through NPS scores, or some combination. And what I would tell you is that what that is saying is where trust stands. It's not telling you what the inputs are that are really breaking it and where the disconnect is. And so you really need to think about measuring trust needs to be one of those KPI indicators on your dashboard, just like the other indicators you have. Because because that engagement survey tends to come back and often is handed off to HR because it's a people problem and HR needs to go fix it. And that's really not what we're talking about here. We're actually talking about this is actually an alignment opportunity for executive teams to begin with, but also for those individual teams as it goes down through the organization. So if we stop at just thinking, well, we measure it through engagement survey, that's actually very incomplete in the process. And our data really shows that.
That is really, really interesting. My next question to you is, how do workforce management decisions around scheduling, flexibility, caregiving, and payroll affect trust at the employee level? Did you learn anything about that or can you measure that with your model A? And how do those things factor in?
Yeah, you can measure it. And so what we found was that strategic clarity, technology and systems trust, and fairness and change are consistent weaknesses across organizations. And those are the exact areas that matter most during what we coined as disruption, right? Big or small. You think about things like we all have these micro disruptions happening at any given time, so personal or professional. And we looked at both. And one of the things that we know is that things like childcare, elder care issues are one of those disruptions. And if we feel that decisions that or policies being made aren't being made through the lens of us as everyday employees, then you start to have that crack in trust. And one of the things that we also found through this research, it was really clear what the most reliable trust builders are. They're, fair treatment and empathy toward employees, open and honest communication, and really visible alignment between why are we making these decisions and the organizational goals. And, every workforce management decision touches all three of these things. So it's really, it was also really clear to us, though, what were the biggest trust destroyers. And we found really interesting, especially as I've been out speaking about this with this data, is that, as I mentioned before, right, there's so much belief of course we want to be trustworthy. And yet the things that are destroying trust are right under our noses and we're not even making the connection of the two. So things like, lack of transparency around trade-offs. And I understand transparency can feel like a loaded word, and it has a continuum, right? It's very there's a lot of depth of what we can do. And when we talk about transparency, um, the perceived misalignment between our leadership decisions and employee needs, and then really poor handling of technology and system
Mm.
rollouts. And so you think about some of the systems that we're talking about that you're so prominent in the conversations you have with listeners. Those are trust opportunity moments that we maybe not are not handling as effectively as we can.
Mhm. I think just to kind of land on that technology piece a little bit more here again, um, that is, I think, organizations truly underestimate, I think, the pall that
Mhm.
is cast over the workforce when a
Yep.
technology rollout goes wrong, and that goes all the or is mishandled or somehow,
Mhm.
maybe it's just kind of like foisted upon folks or whatever. And,
Yep.
and so that goes back to, I mean, this a whole other opens up a whole other conversation around, how should you go about making the decision to change your technology to roll something else out? Like, should you go it alone? Should you use consultants? Like, and what should the breadth of the extent of the consultant, if you go with the consultants or you go with a real high touch vendor, what should what constitutes that? What should the extent of that engagement be to really ensure that you're going to get that technology deployment, implementation and deployment right, so that you're not going to jeopardize your culture.
Yeah, so, it has to start with what are we doing to make sure, we may think this is the right system to put in, and it very well be. We're not suggesting that, you should be surveying your employees to tell you what the right system is. It is about thinking, though, do we actually understand the needs of the not just the business but the employees? Because you and I both know, and we've probably been in similar situations where you can implement what you think is a good system, but if it doesn't work in the workflows of the different individuals and teams, they will quickly find workarounds that just made your very expensive investment worth nothing. And
Yeah.
so the idea of thinking about what are those needs? How can we think about it? Just to put some data behind, where there's operational decisions that are handled poorly. Our data showed that there was a 28% deficit in loss of trust when it was mishandled. And so, if you're going to partner with somebody, it needs to be somebody who actually is thinking about it through the lens of people change impact, not just through, the systems change, because that's just one part of the story. And yes, we want a competent partner, whether internal or external for that, but we need the people side of the business to be inputting into the considerations as well, and not just from a systems only standpoint. One of the
Mm.
things that was really fascinating with the research too is that that technology and systems trust was by far the lowest. And we also saw that relational continuity and psychological safety scored the highest. Those two things are really interconnected in what we're talking about around workforce management challenges, and that gap is where we're seeing so much of the effort that might happen into implementing new systems really break down and not land as well as it could. And so I think the real opportunity is thinking about it from a trust building lens. And the things that we talk about in this report are things that can absolutely be taken into consideration when something, when a vendor partner is being selected, or when internally we're planning for, some big systems changes that inevitably have to happen, but we can still do it in a way that brings people along more effectively.
Mm, mm. Talking about people, what can organizations do to better equip frontline managers to build trust during disruption instead of, unintentionally breaking it?
Yeah. So this is a really huge opportunity, I think, for a lot of organizations. One of the things that jumped out to us might seem a little intuitive, but then when you think about it more deeply, the question becomes, why aren't we making a bigger investment in this area? And that is that local leadership, wherever that is, in the order of an organization, that disruption, when it is mishandled, it drops the most significantly, much greater than trust amongst the organizational leadership level. So it's those tight teams that are the ones that are going to take the biggest hit. So poorly communicated policy change, scheduling decisions that seem unfair, payroll issues that emerge, right? That frontline manager is absorbing that trust damage. And that, is something that those are things that they just didn't even have control over, or they were just told to parrot down the talking points and not actually translate them into what it means for us in our organization. So things that we talk about are things like, there's a way to translate that big picture. You can take what's the big picture saying, and how does it translate into what it means for our team and our workforce? Thinking about how can we be fair and transparent? Well, we can talk about why these changes are coming, or why it's impacting this particular population of the organization in a way that gives more context and shows we went through a process that had those real considerations. It wasn't just, something that feels like or appears to come out of left field. And so we talk about those type of ways to show up on a consistent basis, doing your own audits as a team too, of where are we at from a trust perspective? Do we feel like we're actually finding alignment? And then we talk about a 5 C's framework. So there's a bunch of things we have that we can share. The reality is it has to do with getting that alignment between what we're saying and what we're doing. And one of the things that I'll just say here very quickly that was really surprising to us in this data was that organizations that handled disruption exceptionally well saw their trust scores jump 12% above the baseline, higher than organizations that experienced no disruption at all. And that was really key. So that means a really well handled implementation actually can gain us bigger trust inside our organization. That translates to real numbers around reputation that we measured, real numbers around revenue, and real numbers around retention. And those numbers are really we speak to those in the report. And so again, that's an opportunity. But
Yes.
what we find is that a lot of times that frontline manager, again, they may be middle of the organization managers, but there's not as much investment in what it means to build trust in the way that we were finding as needed in the reporting that came out.
What's interesting around that is really struck me, made me think of this is that old Chinese proverb. I'm not going to get it right, but in every wherever there's danger, there's an opportunity, right?
Hmm.
And so you have the danger of the disruption, but there's the opportunity to actually improve your culture, and
Yeah.
in a measurable way, right? And when you
Mhm.
think about that, because at first, when you said that, at first blush, I thought, oh, that's interesting. An organization that's not undergoing a disruption. Actually, the organization undergoing the disruption actually has the potential to improve its culture more than the organization that's just kind of like
Yeah.
humming along. At first, you think, well, oh, that's weird, but then you think, well, yeah, obviously, it's an opportunity.
Yeah.
It is a touch point. So of course, there's going to be an opportunity, a potentiality of it improving. It's like, and it's also like that idea of polarity that everything has opposites, hot and
Hmm.
cold, danger and opportunity, right? It's all a spectrum, right? Which is really interesting. I'm getting kind of, like high level here, I guess, spirituality even, right? But it's really interesting. And what other thing that struck me though about what you said is, I mean, this makes sense to me. Tell me what you think. It seems to me that the organizations that actually have self awareness, they
Hmm.
actually they actually think about what they're doing and they analyze it and they think it through and they don't necessarily approach anything. There's some things in the background that just hum along, but anything that is of any significance, they maybe say, "Hey, hold up, let's figure
Hmm.
out how we're going to do this so that we do it right." I mean, am I kind of around the mark there?
Yeah, you're right on. So what we were finding is that there's interventions that build or break trust. And when a high trust organization is constantly looking through that lens of trust in everything they do. And those interventions are in play that we call them interventions, but they're in play with how we show up. So when we hold a town hall, we genuinely are asking people to come and ask their questions and we're not shooting them down. There's no fear of retribution. We're really making certain that we're able to answer the best we can. And we'll say, hey, we don't have that answer yet. We're going to have another conversation in 3 weeks because we'll have more information there and you're all invited in. Right. So it's that kind of those moments that are happening. And even in a more, micro scale, having leaders understand trust building inside their team of just knowing why is somebody suddenly showing up for work consistently 5 minutes late when they've always been arriving 5 minutes early. Have
Mhm.
we checked in or have we just assumed they're slacking off? And so really trying to have that understanding and curiosity of why have patterns changed? What can we be doing differently? There's an organization we were talking with that have these mini playbooks for their different categories of change inside the organization that leaders are constantly pulling on and are available to be working through every week with their teams because they're micro exercises. But the idea is it's all that little stuff is building trust. So when something big does happen that they perhaps are it's not on their radar, they've already got a strong foundation to weather it, and that's one of those best practices between the high trust organizations and the low trust organizations.
Yeah, it's super interesting. That's just fascinating. We could talk about this all day. Our podcast is about 20 minutes long, so we gotta wrap it up here. A really, really fascinating stuff. This has been a super illuminating conversation. Thank you so much, Kim, for joining us for the podcast, and we'll have to have you back on sometime.
Well, thank you, Brent. It's been fun to talk about and make these connections. I think it's just such a valuable opportunity to have us thinking about things from a different lens. So I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely.
Thanks for tuning in to the Future of Workforce Management and Payroll Insights by HR.com. We hope today's episode brought you valuable insights and fresh perspectives on the future of payroll and workforce management. Be sure to check out more episodes and explore resources at HR.com/podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, keep innovating and making a difference in the world of payroll and workforce management.